What's up everybody, in this video I'm going to be diving deep into the origins of the Soulsborne genre. While many people will argue that The Legend of Zelda was a massive influence on Soulsborne, and it was, I'm going to leave that particular franchise for a future video, so look forward to that. I will be primarily focusing on Castlevania in this video. I will also be talking about other games that have inspired what would become Soulsborne, but let me know what you think as always too. And before I begin, if you like the video, consider subscribing and sharing it to give my life meaning. And hit the bell to be notified of future uploads. And now, let's begin talking about how Castlevania inspired or possibly even invented the concept of Soulsborne. Castlevania is an action-adventure series where you usually play a heroic warrior on a quest to stop the evil machinations of Count Dracula. And while the original Castlevania games do have influences on the Soulsborne genre, it wasn't until 1997 that this would truly manifest into what we know today. Castlevania Symphony of the Night is the very first time the world would ever hear the term Metroidvania. A Metroidvania is a genre where players are able to explore a non-linear world that is often comprised of multiple levels with either character ability or boss checks in order to progress. It combines the elements of both Metroid, with its need for skills or items to progress, and Castlevania, hence the name Metroidvania. Prior to the creation of Symphony, Castlevania was largely an action-adventure game where players would progress through linear levels towards an end goal. However, one of the older games in the series was Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest, which did have exploration and would be pushed as an example by the development team to Konami in order to bring Symphony of the Night to life. In ways, you can see the inspiration of old school Castlevania in the game and world design of Demon Souls. For example, Demon Souls has exploration, but its levels are designed to push the player forward from level to level until they ultimately reach a definitive end to that stage or world. Symphony of the Night, however, would take this idea of exploration and world design and instead incorporate it to create a massive interconnected world that didn't necessarily need to be played in any one way like previous entries. The game was originally directed by Toru Hagihara, the director of the previous entry Rondo of Blood, which Symphony is a sequel to. However, Hagihara would eventually be promoted to a higher position in the company and would relegate the completion of this new game to his assistant director, Koji Igarashi. According to Igarashi, the idea behind a non-linear level design like World was to increase the replayability of Castlevania, with many bargain bins in Japan being filled with used copies of previous games, mostly because once you beat them, there was little reason to replay them. And also, the development team saw Symphony as a side story to the main games and so decided to deviate heavily from its action-adventure structure and incorporate RPG-like elements. According to Igarashi, RPG mechanics like leveling up and being able to equip weapons and armor was designed to push player creativity, as well as making the game easier to complete, which would lead to this new game reaching a broader audience, since Castlevania games were largely viewed as being hardcore by most gamers at the time. Oh, I wonder where we've heard that term before. Anyway, once development was completed, it was finally released upon the world to universal critical acclaim. Castlevania Symphony of the Night would be considered an instant classic and over time would be praised for its reinvention of the action-adventure genre. It would also go on to be considered one of the greatest and most influential games of all time. And now that you know how Symphony of the Night came to be, it's time to explore how From Software took these elements that would eventually birth a new subgenre in hardcore gaming. The easiest way to explain this is that Soulsborne is like the modernized version of Metroidvania. Sort of like how certain genres of music, like heavy metal, can be attributed to the rise of subgenres like metalcore, which is heavy metal music with hardcore elements. Dark Souls, for example, is very similar to Castlevania Symphony of the Night in how it's structured. Both games take place in a massive, interconnected world that offers non-linear progression where player agency and exploration are key elements to their world designs. A Metroidvania usually requires players to obtain certain abilities in order to progress, like double jumping for example, whereas Soulsborne games instead differ themselves by usually having key items for progression being placed behind pivotal boss encounters, but the concept is similar. Once you actually go back and play a game like Castlevania Symphony of the Night or even Araya of Sorrow, you start to notice how similar games like Dark Souls are to it. Seeing Alucard face off against massive beasts as he travels through Dracula's castle has a connective DNA to how Dark Souls operates and places its encounters as well. Even the concept of bonfires in Dark Souls are directly influenced by the save rooms of Symphony of the Night. They are both these safe havens placed in pivotal locations throughout the game's world for players to get some rest from the dangers outside. The difference being, however, is that in Dark Souls, when you die, the game doesn't end, whereas in Castlevania, you're reverted to your last save. At the core of Metroidvanias and their successor, the Soulsborne genre, are hardcore action RPGs that allow player freedom and tough but fair gameplay. And really, Symphony of the Night's influence can be felt even to this day, with many indie game releases being heavily inspired by it. Some games even take the concepts of both Castlevania and Dark Souls and combine the two into new experiences like Hollow Knight, for example. When you look at Team Cherry's indie game masterpiece, Hollow Knight is probably the most perfect fusion of these two subgenres of gaming that there is. And not only that, but Hollow Knight would also release to universal critical acclaim like Soulsvania before it, which led to other games being inspired by Hollow Knight like Gleamlight or the upcoming Crowsworn. Meaning we're at a point where games are being inspired by games that are inspired by games that are inspired by even older games. When you look at the gaming landscape critically, everything is a copy of something that came before it. Hell, even you and me are just copies of our parents in a sense too. But this doesn't mean that just because something is inspired or has the DNA of a previous entity that it is somehow not unique itself. The concept of Metroidvania has been so instrumental in shaping the legacy of video games that it's just as important as the Doom games are to first-person shooters and beyond. Then you have games like Bloodborne, which are literally just 3D Castlevania games except with massive cosmic aliens. I recently replayed Bloodborne and I made a critique on it, and during that recent playthrough, the inspiration of Castlevania is so prevalent it's kind of ridiculous. Bloodborne's city of Yharnam feels like Dracula's castle, a twisted monolith of cursed corridors riddled with foul beasts and ghastly horrors. Whereas Alucard might be bound to a 2D plane, seeing him slash giant wolves or creepy monsters, it feels right at home with Bloodborne and the streets infested with the Beast Plague. Bloodborne and the first Dark Souls are probably the games that feel the most like Castlevania than the other ones. And it's no surprise that when the community debates which Soulsborne is the best, the two most likely candidates happen to also be the ones closest to the Metroidvania roots. Really, when you start to look at how Soulsborne games are designed, you can actually start to envision them in a 2D sense and quickly realize that very little is lost in translation. At their core, Soulsborne and Souls-likes are just like Castlevania except within a 3D plane of existence, which is awesome to see. In Metroidvanias, however, the skill checks are usually tied to their tools. Games like Axiom Verge, for example, require the player to obtain various items in order to progress. And while games like Dark Souls or Bloodborne don't have tools per se, they instead remix this idea and make the boss encounters mirror this design philosophy. Bosses within Symphony of the Night, for example, are frantic yet incredibly fun to fight. And it's cool how easily these bosses within Castlevania could translate into a Soulsborne-like boss and work incredibly well. Of course, the Soulsborne genre doesn't solely take from Metroid, as like anything in the world, it draws from multiple ideas and sources. One mechanic of Soulsborne games I always loved was the idea of killing a boss and then using that boss's soul to create weapons unique to that enemy. In a lot of ways, this mechanic feels like a modernized version of how Mega Man gains his various abilities when defeating the robot masters. Although instead of being able to shoot stuff like blades, you instead can make weapons that launch giant fire explosions in games like Elden Ring. Speaking of Elden Ring, every legacy dungeon in that game feels like a level within Castlevania too. I mean, Stormvale Castle alone is like the ideal version of how Dracula's castle would work in modern day. So much so that I honestly would love a Castlevania reboot. And speaking of reboots, Castlevania did at one point have this happen. Castlevania Lords of Shadow was a reboot under the supervision of Hideo Kojima, the creator of the Metal Gear Solid games. When Lords of Shadow was in development, the Soulsborne genre was still in its infancy, which led to this reboot taking heavy inspiration from games like God of War and Shadow of the Colossus, which were industry leading at the time. This did anger many fans though, since Castlevania went from being a gameplay heavy game to a very cutscene story driven game instead. But it should also be said that Lords of Shadow is actually the best-selling Castlevania of all time. Like, if you combine all the GBA Castlevania sales, they pale in comparison to just Lords of Shadow, which is crazy. The irony, of course, is that if Castlevania were to come back in today's modern markets, it would likely take inspiration from Bloodborne and Dark Souls. Which is funny, since it would mean that the original game that inspired so many others would inevitably be inspired by the very things it created. And then the comments would come with people saying, so Castlevania is a Souls-like now? Not realizing that Souls-likes wouldn't even exist in the first place without Castlevania, but I digress. Anyway, Symphony of the Night at its core is one of the most influential games of all time, and without its experimentation from how its world was designed or how boss fights interweave with dungeon layouts, I think it's safe to say that the Soulsborne genre as we know it today would not exist without Castlevania. And really, when you start to look outside of Soulsborne into the sea of Souls-likes, you can start to see just how important Castlevania has been in shaping today's gaming landscape. Games like Blasphemous, for example, are quite literally a modern-day Symphony of the Night. With its backtracking, ability checks, and boss fights, Blasphemous would not exist without Hagihara and Igarashi's genre-defining ideas. I mean, Hollow Knight wouldn't exist either, which is just Castlevania with bugs and Dark Souls-like lore. Although that may be underselling it, but you get what I mean. Please don't kill me, Hollow Knight fans. Even newer releases like Steel Rising, for example, are Souls-likes that also incorporate Metroidvania-like elements and the various tools you obtain to further explore the world. And even beyond Souls-likes and ghastly enemies, you have series like Tomb Raider, for example, which uses the tool-like mechanics of Metroidvanias to broaden their worlds as well. Castlevania is so integral for not only being a challenging action game, but being one of the most defining franchises in all of gaming. So many of my favorite games from Bloodborne to Sekiro and beyond would simply not exist if not for Castlevania's incredible design. So really, when you look at it, the original Dark Souls is in a way the new Symphony of the Night of this generation. The way it has been so far-reaching and influential that even franchises like Star Wars or Final Fantasy have taken direct inspiration from the likes of Soulsborne. And it seems like almost every other month we're getting new Souls-like releases such as Amnesia or Steel Rising. Not to mention the upcoming game The Last Faith, which looks almost exactly like Symphony of the Night, which just further shows the legacy of Castlevania in gaming. Of course, while Symphony is considered the ultimate culmination of the Metroidvania design concept, this would all not be possible without the inspiration of Super Metroid. Metroid is considered to be by many the pinnacle of 2D game design. It also predates Symphony by 3 years as well, as Super Metroid is considered the foundation for what Metroidvania would eventually become once it was perfected by Castlevania. Many of the elements seen in Soulsborne and beyond can be attributed to Metroid as well. From the interconnected levels and needing various tools or keys in order to progress, these design elements originated with Metroid. Although I would argue Dark Souls takes more inspiration from Castlevania than Metroid, with Symphony being at its core an action RPG, whereas Super Metroid is much more an action-adventure game. But this does not lessen the impact that Metroid had on games as a whole at all. Not to mention that From Software largely uses dark fantasy as their setting, with some games going full-blown gothic like Bloodborne. And this is where another legendary creator would rise in the form of Ayami Kojima. Look at any artwork for Castlevania and you'll immediately recognize Ayami's work. Her gothic, almost dreamlike style is heavily attributed to the identity of Castlevania as a series and dark fantasy as a whole. Funny enough, Symphony of the Night was actually Ayami's first official game-related project as well, which is insane when you consider the kind of art she designed for the series since it was her first professional gig. What's also insane is that Ayami is actually self-taught, which just further makes her contributions to not only Castlevania but video games in general. She's incredibly talented, and it's due to her unique, almost horror Yoshitaka Amano-like art style that series like Castlevania and dark fantasy in general gets their identity from. Beyond Castlevania, Ayami would also work with Igarashi again when both creators returned to the Metroid genre with Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, which is a modern spiritual successor from the original creators of Symphony. So it's great to see the legacy live on decades later with the same people. But getting back to Metroid, in terms of its core design elements, it can't be understated that Super Metroid is pivotal in the eventual creation of Soulsborne as well. Not to mention the myriad of games to follow like Hollow Knight and beyond. In Metroid, you can find various hidden items that strengthen Samus, which is of course a heavy inspiration for Estus flasks in Dark Souls. But in my opinion, beyond its level design, I think Super Metroid is important because it has always been a series about gameplay first over cutscenes. Because when you think about it, outside of key moments or boss intros, Dark Souls, Elden Ring, and so on have very little cutscenes compared to most games. Which is great because it allows you to play the game, which is what you want to be doing anyway. And Metroid's push for no BS, balls to the wall, let's keep the game moving attitude is for sure a big inspiration for Soulsborne and Symphony and many other games. And although this video is largely about Castlevania Symphony of the Night, it felt weird not mentioning Super Metroid, since it is just as important to the Souls genre too. Although you can't roll up into a ball and pass through small holes in Dark Souls, well, not yet anyway. But I have a creeping suspicion that From Software's next game, which is Armored Core, will be their Super Metroid. You can quote me on that. I also wanted to acknowledge another game that was integral to one of the best features of Soulsborne, which is the concept of New Game Plus. Soulsbornes are largely considered to be one of the best games when it comes to this feature because they allow you to play again but with harder enemies and all your gear and stats. As for which game was responsible for this feature, some would argue Zelda 2, others would say Ghosts and Goblins, but I just want to shout out the game I think did it right, and that's Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger did New Game Plus all the way back in 1995, and it's a feature I'm glad exists because of how integral it is to Souls. And it's really no wonder I love Soulsborne so much when it combines the likes of Castlevania, Metroid, Chrono Trigger, and Zelda. So while Castlevania was of course integral to Souls, I just really want to also acknowledge the various inspirations from games like Mega Man to Chrono Trigger, which were also integral to the overall design of what makes Soulsborne so riveting. If anything, I hope this video essay helped you in understanding and appreciating just how far-reaching and massive the lineage is when it comes to Soulsborne. It's incredible to think that the city of Yharnam or the desolate lands of Lothric and beyond would never even exist without the incredible design and ingenuity of games like Metroid and Castlevania and beyond. Soulsborne as we know it would simply not exist without the adventures of a bounty hunter known as Samus Aran and the heroic vampire Alucard. And for that, I am grateful to those franchises. Because of them, it ended up with the birth of Souls, and because of Souls, we are seeing this legacy continue with new and interesting ideas that are helping push the industry forward in a creative and healthy way. And by that, I mean it's forging a path that is hopefully free of microtransactions, battle passes, and always online games as services. Because as popular as those trends are, nothing beats sitting on your couch by yourself, controller in hand, and experiencing a world that is both riveting and complete. So whether it's fighting beast plagues, creepy aliens, or ghastly knights, it's thanks to Castlevania and the concept of Metroidvanias that we have Soulsbornes, and I'll always be grateful for that. And that, my friends, is how Castlevania and Metroid invented the Soulsborne genre. And don't worry, one day I'll dive deep into the other massive inspiration, but I'll leave that for another day. I hope you enjoyed, and consider liking and subscribing to give my life meaning, and thank you for 20,000 subscribers. It's insane that so many people like what I do, so just thank you. I plan to keep exploring the history of games with my own unique cynical twist, so I hope you enjoy. Thanks to my patrons for their undying support, And I'm Endymion.